Today he will talk about the picture of Agnes Martin promoted by her and reproduced in the reception. During his talk, Jonathan will refer to Donald Woodman's new book, Agnes Martin and Me. He will focus, among others, on the topic of mental illness and show us his very sensitive connection that he does between the fact and the artist production. I'm sure that you all know Jonathan Katz and his important scientific but also political work, but let me just introduce him to you. Jonathan currently is the chair of the Art Department of Visual Studies in at the University at Buffalo. Before he was associate professor at Yale University. Jonathan is a key figure and author of numerous books on sexuality in the post-war American art. He originated and co-curated the exhibition Hide, Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture in 2010. It was the first queer exhibition ever mounted in a major US museum, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. Hide Seek received the 2011 Best National Museum Exhibition Award from the National Association of Art Critics. Currently, he's completing his book on the Silent Camp, Jasper Jones, Robert Rauschenberg, and the Cold War. His newest book, Art, AIDS, America, was published in 2015, accompanying his exhibition that opened in LA and will now travel to Atlanta, New York, and Chicago over the next 2 years. As the president of the new Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York City, he has curated recent exhibitions on Paul Thek, the German turn-of-the-century artist Sascha Schneider, and the exhibition on 500 years of shifting definitions on sexuality and the classical nude. Jonathan Katz, we are very curious to your talk, and I would like to welcome you here in Düsseldorf.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Ironically, it's polarity, the embrace of two opposing forces, that is the one bloodline that unites Agnes Martin's varied artworks, published statements, and other writings into a conceptual whole. This binaristic frame of mind is mostly evident, I think, in her grids, with their opposing horizontal and vertical axes, but it is equally visible in her published writings, such as her so-called Willie's stories, where Martin narrates her peculiar split perspective, in this instance, ventriloquized through the voice of God. She once wrote, and I quote her, "And God says, everything stays the same, and everything changes. What is in the world is really opposites," end quote. Note that the world isn't simply composed of opposites, for it is equally important to her that these opposites peacefully coexist. How can something stay the same and change? Because while things constantly change in their particularities, an endless cycle of birth and withering and death, they remain the same at a certain remove, the way the rush of a stream at a certain height can instead seem stolid and still. Anything, then, is both a product of its identity as well as how it is perceived. Agnes Martin's 1963 Nightsea does this same thing, this embrace of two contradictory realities, although thankfully at average viewing distance. Look long enough, and it unemphatically reverses itself, transposing expected relations of identity and temporality. At some point in looking at this painting, unexpectedly and all at once, the image will flip 180 degrees. And what you took to be the foreground, the thin, not unfamiliar white grid incised into an all-over blue field, will evaporate into a most delicate white reserve of gessoed canvas, a thin tracery ground peeking through an emerging thicket of painstakingly painted small blue rectangles. No longer a mere background, this sea of blue rectangles will then individuate, compelling you to look closer at the newly autonomous cereal blue fields that have suddenly become the subject of the painting. At once the same and yet also different, both one thing and another, this painting affects the very transformational ontology that haunts Martin's poetics. Using the most simple, stripped-bare, indeed self-evident pictorial terms, Night Sea instantiates an unexpected gulf between what appears to be true and what is true. Spend long enough with Agnes Martin, look hard enough, read enough of her prescriptions for making art or looking at it, and one enters a world of metaphysical doubt where the eyes lie, skepticism is insight, and geometry can become a vehicle of expression of the most personal kind. It's a topsy-turvy world where illusion can be truer than reality, where appearance can diverge from core identity, where perception and actuality duke it out to a draw. Yet this is not an unfamiliar Agnes Martin. Metaphysical doubt is now her middle name. But with all this attention to the evocation and unification of oppositions in her artwork, one thing remains strikingly true. We can't talk about Agnes Martin the person, her struggles, her life, and its relationship to her art. In the US, at least, we are still largely in the death grip of October magazine's bloodless discourse, its dry engineering of paintings so that they can expound endlessly about their own discursive conditions, save one who painted them. In US contemporary art criticism, as a result, one short text above all others has come to assume a position of prominence. It's Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. Despite the fact that Foucault effectively gutted many of Barthes' claims in his much more socio-historically nuanced What is an Author from 1969, Barthes' flat-footed polemic continues to circumscribe what we're permitted to say about Agnes Martin now, 45 years later. Yet no artist better emblematizes the paradox that we were permitted to address authoriality in the October era only in terms of anti-authoriality. In Martin's art, absence, abandonment, renunciation become her chosen forms of self-expression. Validating only the mechanics of perception and cognition, many of the most famous accounts of Martin's work, among them Rosalind Krauss's well-known essays, rule anything else out of order, outside the explanatory purview of the modernist machinery. With their obsessive attention to form and its affect, such studies retail a high modernism with a human face, a subtle recuperation through phenomenology of the old idea of the self-realizing work of art, now expanded to include the viewer. But when critics like Krauss recuse the artist in favor of her means, they unwittingly fall into Martin's well-made trap, for she's already mediated that response, which is to say, set it up, seeded it, anticipated, and then seduced it. And not only in her paintings, but in her voluminous statements and parables, her famous hermit-like self-sufficiency, her Zen-inflected paeans to humility and pridelessness, all of which serve to underscore that there is nothing individuated or particularized, nothing referenced or encoded in her art. Paradoxically, the more Martin exposed her feelings, thoughts, and aims as an artist, the more evanescent she became, and the less obviously a mediator of the meaning of her work. But what if instead of playing along, we were to try to get behind this authorial transparency and ask why, in the first place, an artist would strive to erect a Trojan horse of signification, seeking to elevate the operations of meaning-making ahead of the maker of meaning herself? What if we stopped replicating Agnes Martin's repressions of Agnes Martin and instead attended to the evidence of agency in her work, thereby finding a way out of the ironic mirrored cell where she authored our anti-authorial interpretations of her work? Suspended over this analysis, like a pictorial metaphor, is a work like Night Sea. With its penchant for inversion, its suspended oppositions, its thematization of a gulf between appearance and reality, and its tendency to actively and repeatedly recast the terms of its own identity as an object. In its split ontology, Nietzsche recapitulates the bifurcated construction of perception that Martin routinely formulated, as in this example. Quote, before and behind self-expression is a developing awareness in the mind that affects the work. This developing awareness I will also call the work. Note that within her ontological narrative, like so many of Martin's narratives, and like so much of Zen thought, there is this erection of a binary or bifurcated real, this newly split conceptualization of what is generally understood as singular and whole is couched as an investment in the surfacing of a new, more accurate ontology that dismisses appearance as illusory and rewards attentiveness to what lies beneath. Note, too, that this dimorphic purchase on the real is systemic and totalizing. It's not part of Nietzsche, after all, that changes, but rather its wholesale ontology as an object. And similarly, in Martin's terms, the work of the mind has the potential and promise to utterly recast the work of the hands. My point is that throughout Martin's poetics, as in her work itself, we see and sense a profound split between conceptual and manual achievement. In that split, it is that split ontology that is my subject today. Let me show you. Oops. Again and again, critics have characterized Martin's mature work in terms of a tense stasis in which oppositions are neither superseded nor synthesized, but suspended and contained. Indeed, the more Martin attends to the surface, betraying the idiosyncratic marks of her hand and process, the more transcendental the work can seem, the more it flees from the particular into the general. A partial list of the active antagonisms contained within any of her mature works would have to include the tension between surface and depth, form and formlessness, incident and order, drawing and painting, aspect and totality, materiality and spirituality, gesture and geometry. But by the end of this analysis, I hope to show that Martin's spiritual and pictorial pursuit of such an actively doubled or split perspective was in fact key to her schizophrenia, not as a manifestation of her illness, but rather the very opposite, as a coping mechanism. That the demands of negotiating lifelong mental illness led her to echo some of the defining symptoms of her schizophrenia in her art, including an active tension between order and disorder, and reality and transcendence, and especially between reason and illusion, is one of the great ironies of her art. But it is not, I want to underscore, its symptom. She was not prey to her mental illness, but worked to resist it at every turn. This took great discipline and determination, and many of the defining aspects of Martin's biography, her abrupt moves, her solitary lifestyle, her self-sufficiency and refusal of material pleasures, were all aspects of that steely self-control that put health and clarity as its primary values. So instead of the usual account of a figure's mental illness, which suggests all the various ways someone succumbed to their disease, I instead see Martin's illness as evident only in the manifold ways it was aggressively resisted. She herself repeatedly suggested as much in many of her comments and koans. If I understand her career as a progressive attempt at the containment, control, and eventual renunciation of an unquiet artistic selfhood, she often said as much herself. In one published interview, after quoting a line from her celebrated creed, The Untroubled Mind, the very title of which, The Untroubled Mind, should tell us that this is a fecund direction for inquiry into her work, Martin added the following, quote, "The absolute trick in life is to find rest," unquote. And then she drew a moving portrait of what she was trying to find rest from. I quote her, "Lie flat on your back and stop thinking. Then something will happen. It creeps up to you from all sides and brings you unheard of torment. You wind and shake yourself in torment until you finally let go, and everything falls away from you. Then there is only clarity and recognition, and your imagination awakens. Yes, I've broken a chair once in that kind of state, a real rocking chair with feathers, and it was already in two before I knew where I was myself, end quote. Note here that torment is a product of the cessation of active thought, and salvation comes in letting go, in the form of a new, highly imaginative clarity. This is, at core, an account of a battle between illness and health, illusion and reason. And Martin's reassertion of control clearly comes at some cost. One of the ironies of mental illness is that the mind is at one and the same moment both the symptom and the cure. What changes in the attainment of health, then, isn't the ontology of the thing itself, but rather and simply our perspective on it. So for schizophrenics, above the rest of us, perspective is key. And terms like reality and illusion are not just the usual metaphorical analogy, but a very pressing demand for self-adjustment and clarity of thought. Surely it is not much of a stretch to postulate some sort of connection between such a mental horizon and the authorship of credos revealingly entitled like Untroubled Mind, What is Real, The Still and Silent in Art. To people close to her, such as Donald Woodman, whose newly published Agnes, Martin, and Me is a treasure trove of daily details of nearly a decade spent in concert with the artist as her helper and handyman and often sole company, mental illness was a topic she herself would often broach. She writes, quote, Agnes fell into a reverie about her time at Quenty's Slip, describing how there had been formed a real community. She emphasized that they had interacted quite a lot and really supported one another. Then, catching me totally by surprise, she told a story about how Robert Indiana had to rescue her from the mental ward at Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan, where she had been committed and had undergone shock therapy. This was my first inkling of the history of her mental instability, end quote. These are, I don't quite know. We are a bit out of order, sorry about that, but we will get there. There we go. I'm showing you her falling blue. In what follows, I'm going to try to walk a narrow and somewhat tortuous path at great height without falling, trying to meld three interrelated aspects of Martin's art. One, its production of itself is both manual and ideational, suspended between abstract thought and concrete embodiment. Two, its production of yet another kind of split ontology, this time between order and disorder. And finally, three, its production of a final split between the notions of the ideal and the real. And of course, these binarisms structure her images themselves. I'm not really reading off of them. In Falling Blue, the opposition between line and field structures and informs the image every bit as much as the opposition between vertical and horizontal structures the grid in works like Gray Stone. These ramifying binarisms are one of Martin's most characteristic achievements, evidence of how often the coexistence of two extremes are not merely related to Martin's poetics, but in fact foundational to it. For in the final analysis, as I suggested at the outset, it is this fact of polarity itself that is the signal of her cognitive struggle towards controlling her own illness. For her, notions like changing perspectives, clarity, and troubledness are not metaphors. They are instead prescriptions for mental rehabilitation central to the achievement of cognitive health. Yet we almost never address Martin's work in terms of mental illness, and indeed, only Woodman's new book and Nancy Princenthal's recent biography even so much as mention what was perhaps the defining struggle of her life. Part of this is because a coterie of friends of Martin's have assiduously protected her from any form of stigmatized identity, whether in terms of her mental illness or her lesbianism. We know Martin's first serious hospitalization seems to have occurred while she was on trip in India and that her friend and one-time lover, Lenore Tawney, helped her get home. There would be several other serious hospitalizations, including horrific stays at Bellevue, but every time her friends rescued her, getting her transferred upon commitment to better facilities. In contrast to her reluctance to address her illness, Martin herself was hardly shy on the subject, though she often used a somewhat coded language to describe what had occurred. For her, such signaled Martin terms as trance, innocence, struggle, voices, demons, terror, all do double duty as terms to describe her schizophrenia, which included not only the usual symptoms, but often amnesia and catatonia as well. She was given to personifying her illness, describing her different voices as different personalities, or even externalizing her illness as a frightening incarnation. As Martin wrote in The Perfection Underlying Life, and I quote her here, "The solitary life is full of terrors. Worse than the terror is the fear of the dragon," and in this she's always capitalizing the dragon. The dragon really pounds through the inner streets, shaking everything and breathing fire. The fire of his breath destroys and disintegrates everything. The solitary person is in great danger from the dragon, because without an outside enemy, the dragon turns on the self, end quote. This fire-breathing dragon, pounding the interior streets and disintegrating everything, was what she set herself on guard against. In this respect, art was her helpmate, allowing her to remind herself of states or conditions vastly different than the one she was then experiencing. As Martin described this painting, Sorry. Can we go one more? Oh, there we go. This painting, This Rain, the painting with two rectangles. Oh, sorry. There we go. The painting with two rectangles represents the two major states of mind, a fact that I realized long after I painted them. All the paintings after that represent the lightest state, or if the heavier, in its lightest mood. Here again, her active dimorphic perspective is implicitly linked to her mental happiness. Whereas most abstraction in 20th century art references the real, either abstracted from it, as in Picasso, or via claiming a dumb materiality itself, as in Donald Judd, or even invoking a conceptualism that works in the gulf between the material real and the conceptual, as in the work of Lawrence Weiner, Martin's work instead seems closer to an early 20th century notion of vitalism, akin to Kandinsky's metaphysical precepts, with its implicit call to transcendence, to a world beyond the material and the phenomenal. It thus makes mind, not matter, its central concern, and is celebrated, I think, rightly for its evanescent character, as if fleeing its own materiality. Yet even Prinzenthal's sensitive account seems to try to cleave her art from mental illness, as if art made in response to imbalance was somehow unworthy or suspect. Perhaps this is because we tend to think of mental illness as producing expressive excess in the spirit of outsider art, or at its highest form, in a Van Gogh, wildly gestural, teetering between abandon and control. Externalized, mental illness is framed as the id incarnate. But Martin's art is on an exactly obverse trajectory, evoking not abandon, but expertise, not wildness, but deliberation and patience. Her work is hyper-controlled, subjecting uncontrolled to the operations of purposefulness and discipline to an almost unparalleled degree. Thus it invokes the mind over and above its material incarnation, a realm of pure ideationality that seems to lift off from the surface of the canvas and float somewhere above it. Externalized, it is not id, but id's sworn enemy, the superego, deliberately, as Martin reminds us, made light. As hypostasized mentality, it's the converse response to her dragon, that traditional framing of mental disquiet as a looming threat to coherence and self-unity. But this reversal of the normative construction of mental illness testament to her self-conscious opposition to its cultural codes, entails yet a further problem. In making mind externalized, an object outside the self and in dialogue with it, Martin unwittingly replicates a defining condition of schizophrenia, whereby the self is divided between different contradictory positions. Voiced outside the head, it is thus made autonomous, and consequently made subject to the vicissitudes of all objects, including degradation, decay, and damage. For Martin, innocence is the term that countervails this externalized selfhood. It is the self as whole, before differentiation, rather akin to Freud's notion of the oceanic feeling, that sense of connectedness or wholeness that's felt between the self and the outside world. Listen to Martin try to describe innocence in an interview with Joan Simon, and you'll see what I mean. And note that in this description, she is explicitly connecting the attainment of innocence to her art, for the fashionable segregation of art from life was never something that Martin subscribed to. So she answers the question, and I quote her as follows: "Why I picked the grid? I didn't pick it. It came to me as an inspiration. I was thinking about innocence, and then I saw it in my mind, that grid. And so I thought, well, I'm supposed to paint what I see in my mind, so I painted it, and sure enough, it was innocent." Innocent? "The grid expresses innocence," she answers. The interviewer: "How? In what? Is it the way you put the line down? What is it that makes you use the word innocence?" She answers, "Well, it just looks like innocence." So the interviewer then tries another tack. "You speak of the film Gabriel as being about innocence as well as happiness and beauty. It seems that what you're looking for in both mediums, though they're so different from one another, is similar." And Martin answers, "To think of climbing a mountain is a kind of innocence. You know that you're going to be rewarded by climbing a mountain. I thought the boy in the film was innocent." "Why did you call him Gabriel?" "Gabriel is beyond the world." "Was the name specifically derived from the biblical angel Gabriel?" "Oh, no. I meant he was innocent like an angel. You climb a mountain to get out of this world," end quote. So innocence in Martin's lexicon is a kind of unified, unself-conscious selfhood, when you and your intentions are one and you do not have to stand outside yourself to examine your objectives and their meanings. As she put it, to think of climbing a mountain is a kind of innocence. You know that you're going to be rewarded by climbing a mountain. Most of us are innocent in this definition most of the time, and it is one of the more painful recognitions of Martin's condition that this state is unusual enough for her as to merit its own terminology. Children are innocent in that they too are, if you will, inside their impulses, unable to view them from the outside. But this could not be Martin's life, for she was perforce required to always stand in judgment of her feelings, to guard against their excesses. Most strikingly, she says, it's the grid that expresses this innocence. And while what she actually means, of course, is open to debate, I think she means by that the grid is the most transparent and self-evident of all pictorial designs. It pretends to be nothing beyond what it is. And yet for all that, as we know from seeing Martin's work, within its regularity, there are an infinite number of variations, as if the grid's internal rigor and regularity is always about to turn in against itself. For Martin, then, the phenomenal world was therefore rarely innocent in her sense, in the sense of an unself-conscious melding of affect and intention. Rather than innocence, she knew she needed almost always, almost everywhere, a dimorphic perspective wherein feelings were adjudicated against knowledge, tested for their soundness of mind. And no credo makes more or better use of the dimorphic perspective than Zen. In Zen, finally, she found her schizophrenia realized, generalized, remade as a defining precept of our collective relation to the real. Still, Zen was a strange precept for Martin to adopt in that she did little that conformed to traditional Zen practice. The ideological obverse of John Cage's far more orthodox Zen aesthetic, realized in works like 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where the audience is free to make of it what they will, Martin was always quick to contextualize, even preach, despite her endorsement of the autonomy of meaning-making. Cage, who was nothing if not didactic, nonetheless structured his lectures and writings in accordance with Zen precepts, often creating meditative spaces for individual contemplation through, for example, subjecting Joyce's Finnegan's Wake to the chance operations dictated by the I Ching. Yet in her 1979, What We Do Not See If We Do Not See, Martin unself-consciously inhabits a prescriptive and prophetic voice that is vastly more Western, even dogmatic, than its Zen trimmings would suggest. She writes things like, "Until you can clear up your true identity, you will be tied to this life. I have come to tell you the easiest way to find an answer to this question." End quote. Martin regularly assumed the mantle of the collective, which she then spoke to and for. "We feel," she once wrote, "that we should not live just the same way as our ancestors live. We feel we should take a step forward." Prophetic leadership, doctrinaire mandates, and self-help directives in a Zen vein underscore the incoherence of Martin's deployment of the idiom, for Zen holds fast to a notion that while insight may be learned, it cannot be straightforwardly taught, for teaching generalizes one person's reality for another. While Martin's paintings may be invitations, her words tend toward the command. So it's not Zen's radical democracy of belief that Martin values, nor its openness to subjective experience. It is rather Zen's dimorphic grip on the real that makes it a readily available analog to her own cognitive experiences. Zen always posits that split reality, one in which the discrete phenomenal world is illusory, masking a deeper and more profound unified reality that undergirds it. So Zen endorses a kind of training program wherein what we think we know is subjected to scrutiny, examined against this history of phenomenal illusion. As she wrote in an undated letter to the curator of her first retrospective, "We dwell in illusion." I'm quoting her here. "And as we recognize the many faces of illusion, we become increasingly aware of reality. At one point, we pass a barrier to truth that is called enlightenment in Zen. We then know the whole truth or reality, but we ourselves have not changed." End quote. So enlightenment demands disciplined practice to puncture the illusory for the true. For her, discipline is the extinguishing of desire in the context of that pursuit. It frustrates a means-end rationale. As Martin wrote in her manuscript For Perfection Underlying Life, quote, "Going on without resistance or notion is called discipline. Going on when hope and desire have been left behind is discipline. Going on in an impersonal way without personal considerations is discipline. Not thinking, planning, scheming is a discipline. Not caring or striving is a discipline." End quote. And for Martin, disciplined perception is key to evading the illusory, for alone it is immediate or innocent in her lexicon. Perception merely is. What we make of that perception is where we so often go wrong. As she wrote in her notes to the Untroubled Mind, quote, "Perception is the primary experience. Thinking, we consider that which we have perceived. It is the secondary experience. Thinking compares everything we have perceived with everything we are perceiving at the moment. There is no difference between thinking and relative living. Those who depend on the intellect are many. Those who depend upon perception alone are the few." And I hope it's clear by now that at every turn, she's instantiating these two right realities, these completely opposing perspectives. Artists, she argued, were among the few adults who depended on perception, and thus who had a hope of reclaiming their innocence. But most people were unaware that the real was illusory, and so they lived happily in their illusions. As she wrote in her Perfection Underlying Life, quote, "It is from our awareness of transcendent reality and a response to concrete reality that our minds command us on our way to full response. Complete consciousness is present to us at all times, at every moment, but we reject it in order to maintain our prejudices and our ideas." Lest this sound like a willful and prescriptive program, Martin's quasi-Zen precepts are, for all their prophetic fervor, generally achieved only in and through a state of helplessness. They can't really be forced or even learned. she finally comes to understand. Rather, they come when we are so spent that all our resistance is laid low. As she once noted, quote, "But helplessness when fear and dread have run their course, as all passions do, is the most rewarding state of all. It is the time when our most tenacious prejudices are overcome, our most tightly gripped resistances come under the knife, and we are made more free," end quote. She continues, "It is so hard to realize at the time of helplessness that it is the time to be awake and aware," end quote. In helplessness, then, we are freed of our credence in illusion. Still, there's nothing systematic about Martin's thinking, and her writing frequently contradicts itself. The only unchanging consistency in her thought is the sense of a doubled or dimorphic purchase on the real. And as she repeatedly noted, absent that doubled vision, nothing really works. Reality becomes a kind of ghost ship at night, seemingly solid, but utterly illusory. I quote her, "For those who are visual-minded, I will say, there seems to be a fine ship at anchor. Fear is the anchor. Convention is the chain. Ghosts stalk the deck. The sails are filled with pride, and the ship does not move," end quote. To move the ship, a countermanding push, a binary perspective, a recognition of polarity was needed. But Martin's work didn't always stand perfectly poised between polarities in an analog to her doubled perceptions. That achievement was the singular, hard-won triumph of her career. Most of the attempts along the way she presumably destroyed, but one that survived we've seen. And it survived presumably in part because Lenore Tawney owned it. A distinct sculptural presence, it contains among the earliest surviving iterations of a grid, here rendered with boat spikes. But as found objects, the spikes' insistent materiality anchor the work too firmly in the objective realm, blocking any countermanding push towards transcendence. Her Water of the same year suffers the same fate, for it makes a grid of bottle caps nailed to the surface, and of course, the blue-gray composition, or the missing bones too, right, do the same. But because they fail to equilibrate, this time because the clear black and white tones seem to cement the foreground and background into their accustomed place. The point is that we can't just talk about the grid in Martin, for anyone who spends time with her grids comes to marvel at how different and nuanced, varied they are. And what characterizes certain of these grids as mature is their equilibrium. While the celebrated mature works date more or less to after 1962, there are a number of notable mature works prior to this date. This suggests that Martin didn't fully understand how to achieve her goals at first, and the early work of the 1960s is uneven as a consequence, with monodimensional works like blue-gray composition or brown composition actually post-dating some of the greatest paintings of her career, like the sublime Gray Stone 2 from 1961, in which everything stands in such perfect equilibrium that the painting oscillates before the eye as if it were breathing alive. But whether successful or not, these early works all try in various ways to achieve that signature tense balance. And one of the most fascinating elements of her career is to watch her thinking through various means to equilibrate and balance her art. Once she comes to understand how to use the grid format to do so, she becomes profligate in her paint handling, showily employing the medium least respectful of a straight-line watercolor to balance the rectilinear ink or graphite in a magnificent series of small paintings. These untitled works begin in 1963 and are notably more successful than works of but a year or two earlier, wherein the rectilinearity of the image was countered with arches or triangles or ovals drawn in ink or graphite. Martin signals her evolving understanding of her own strength when she tells the curator of her first retrospective, "Please do not show any paintings with circles." Circles failed, I think, because they were self-contained, totemic presences. They can't admit of a countermanding push to decenter them. Art needed that binary, that tense stasis between opposing forces, if it was to flee the too personal and the too invested. She once noted, quote, "The classical is cool because it is impersonal." The problem was that Martin ran hot, but she strived to be cool. Thank you.